Christopher Graham talked about the brave new world. I hope I'm not part of the sad old world, Chris. But at the heart of my career has been the consumer. I worked for the National Consumer Council, the Office of Fair Trading, and I was deputy chairman of Which, the consumer organisation, throughout my career, quite apart from being Information Commissioner. It was the consumer cause which really protested against this alienating approach. It was Which magazine which revealed that Hamlet has 30,066 words, Shakespeare's longest play. PayPal, 34,798. One of our poor, sad researchers had to count the words. It's also been revealed.
Big data, I guess, isn't it?
Yes, exactly.
Microsoft does have a technology that'll do that for you.
Exactly. I know that.
I can get you a copy.
I don't know how many people here signed up to GameStation, where 7,500 people assigned their immortal soul to GameStation without reading the small print. I don't know how many people signed up to PC Pitstop, where in the small print, anyone who writes in gets $1,000. It took 4 months before anyone wrote in to get their $1,000. Consumers don't want to be made to be liars. And if you tick the box which says, I have read, I have understood, and I accept all these words, otherwise I cannot take part in this activity or have this service delivered, you are a liar. And that is not good public policy to make a nation, a continent, a world of liars. And what's worse, the notice-based approach, I think, allows far too much permissiveness on the part of organisations. If you get a good lawyer to write into your clauses this, that, or the other, it gives you incredible freedom. That is not acceptable in terms of good, effective regulation. My slogan in all of this, Jules, is effective data protection in practice. Pragmatism is a word which I am proud to use. One of my concerns is, I'm not going to be attacking the European approach or praising the US approach. I mean, here in the UK, we sort of look both ways and get shot at from both sides. So we're used to that. But I think in some ways the European approach is too short on words, in some ways far too long. Fundamental rights and freedoms. That phrase is used a lot, both in language and in the texts of the various legislation. In my experience, the vast majority don't understand what is meant by fundamental rights and freedoms. It's either meaningless or ambiguous. And that includes software engineers, doctors, policemen, bankers who need to understand this sort of concept. And yet at the same time, the European approach can be far too wordy, far too, I've used the word theological. I started looking at the opinion, the Article 29 opinion on legitimate interests. I'm sure it's packed full with very good stuff. I haven't got beyond much the executive summary, but the entire opinion is 68 pages of dense argument. It's all good stuff when you get into it, but 68 pages is not the right way to communicate what we're trying to do. So I took part in this group which Fred and Peter have mentioned, and if you read that, you'll see a balanced, nuanced approach aiming for effective data protection in practice. It is, if it comes about, a brave new world. It won't come about immediately, but I think it's signpost. But it does, in particular, signpost a greater emphasis on use. It's not, as Peter said, an abandonment or a focus on collection, but it tries to look at what's happening in reality, not just what might be happening, not just at the collection stage. And it does try to articulate the fundamental rights and freedoms in terms of harms and risk. And most of you will know I'm now with the Centre for Information Policy Leadership. We pioneered the work on accountability, and we now have a project which is underway on what is really meant by a risk-based approach. And I talked to a small workshop here on Tuesday about that. It's still very much work in progress. We've drawn upon the work which the CNIL in France did on risk methodology, on the work which Chris and my former colleagues in a very non-bureaucratic environment have been doing on privacy impact assessments and so on. And essentially what we're trying to say is that we need to communicate what this privacy protection is all about and trying to identify tangible harms, whether that's bodily harm, loss of liberty, loss of freedom of movement, damage to earning power, significant damage to economic interests. Then moving on to the intangibles, reputational harm, detriment from the monitoring or exposure of identity, characteristics or activities, fear, anxiety or embarrassment arising from unacceptable intrusion into family life, discrimination and stigmatization, trying to bring these to life, not as concrete perhaps as they might be in some respects, but trying to bring a more objective contextual approach. And not last but not least, societal harm, where there can be damage to the democratic institutions of nations or continents, or loss of social trust where people don't know who knows what about whom. And what we're trying to do is bring more concrete, pragmatic language into the debate and make that the focus of regulation. And the final word I use, because it's relevant to all this, it's a phrase I have used before once or twice, selective to be effective. It has to be about prioritization. It has to be looking at those areas where there is the greatest risk, the most likely that substantial, significant harm is going to be caused to consumers or to society. And that, I believe, is the way forward, not the old bureaucratic tick box approach.